Okay, so this recording is going to be for Marine Biology Module 10. And this specifically will be helpful for the GCA students. So this chapter deals with estuaries. So last module we talked about the intertidal zone, and now we're going to talk about estuaries and try to especially focus on the unique characteristics and challenges of this area of an estuary. That what challenges does it present for animals that live there or plants that live there, but then also what advantages do they provide. So let's talk about, let's first just come up with a definition. So an estuary would be present where you have an ocean that is bordering land, but then more specifically, it's where the fresh water joins salt water. And that creates a unique ecosystem that we call an estuary. So in the United States, some of the estuaries that you may be familiar with, maybe you didn't, probably didn't know they were estuaries, but the San Francisco Bay is one, and we'll look at that a little more specifically in a bit. Tampa Bay. So Tampa is on the west coast side of the Florida Peninsula. And then another one is the Mississippi River Delta. So it's where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico in New Orleans. So the mouth of the river, the mouth of the Mississippi River is the Mississippi River Delta. Okay, so another important thing about estuaries is that in many cases where there is an estuary, there are also cities that have been, or establishment of cities in those areas, because there's an abundant food supply, and it's also a waterway. So many times there are large cities in the areas of estuaries. So we're going to talk about different types of estuaries, but how did those estuaries get established? How did we end up with estuaries? Well, scientists all agree that estuaries were formed when the Ice Age ended. Now, not everybody agrees on how long ago the Ice Age ended, but everybody agrees that there was an Ice Age, and that when large amounts of ice melted, that of course led to the sea level rising. And then the water from the rising sea levels, then the water moved into the mouths of rivers. It moved into lower levels and into the mouths of rivers. Okay, so that's how scientists believe that these unique ecosystems that we call estuaries were formed. They were formed at the end of the Ice Age. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to go through some of the different types of estuaries, and we'll talk about how uniquely each of them was formed. So the first type is called a drowned river valley. Sometimes it can also be called a coastal plain estuary. And in this type of estuary, what you have is you have narrow areas that tend to be deeper, and then you have more broad, shallow areas. And these narrow areas are believed to have been the original riverbed. And then with the rising sea levels and with the melting of ice and the rising sea levels, then the broad shallow area that surrounds the narrow area is due to the ocean levels rising with the melting of ice. Okay, so let me show you a picture of a drowned river valley. This is actually not a photograph, but a schematic drawing. So these narrow areas here in the middle are believed to have been what would have been the original riverbed here. Okay, the narrow, and they're deeper, but then those are surrounded by a broader, more shallow area. So this would have been the original riverbed, and then this area here was due to the rising levels of the sea. Okay, so that is the drowned river. So the term is appropriate. It's a river that basically got drowned by the rising sea levels. Okay, so that's the first type of estuary. A second type of estuary is called a bar-built estuary. And if you have ever heard of a barrier island, that is really what a bar-built estuary is. So there are barrier islands off the coast of North Carolina, and you also see bar-built estuaries in the Gulf of Mexico. So how is a bar-built estuary formed? Well, basically what happens is that sand and mud get moved around by waves, and as that sand and mud get moved around, they build up to form a barrier. And so what you end up with is a barrier between the ocean. So you have this sand barrier between the ocean water and between the fresh water from the river. So in other words, if you have the river here and it's going to be fresh water, and you have the ocean over here and it's going to be salt water, and then you have this barrier in between, so that the fresh water is going to concentrate more on this side, and the salt water will concentrate more on this side. So between the land and the sandbar, you're going to have fresh water, and between the sandbar and the ocean, you're going to have more of the salt water, but there will still be some mixing of those. I don't believe your textbook has a picture of one of those. No, it does not. Okay, so there's no picture that I can show you of a bar-built estuary. Okay, the next one is called a fjord, and fjords are especially prevalent in the country of Norway. And what happened to form a fjord is the movement of glaciers. So glaciers moved near the coast, and then that as those glaciers moved near the coast, that created these deep valleys. And then with the melting of the ice at the end of the Ice Age, valleys, let's add an S to that, and then melting ice filled those valleys. So we have these deep valleys filled with water, deep and steep valleys filled with water and land on either side. So let me show you a picture of a fjord. Okay, so here's a fjord. So the movement of the glaciers would have carved out these valleys that you see are now filled with water. Okay, so that is a fjord. Okay, next one, the next type of estuary is a river delta. And I've already mentioned the Mississippi River Delta. In your study of Egypt, you may also have come across the Nile River Delta. So the Mississippi River, the headwaters of the Mississippi River, where the Mississippi River starts, is up in northern Minnesota. And then it travels all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and it dumps into the Gulf of Mexico in New Orleans. So the mouth of the river is in New Orleans. So what happened? What happens to build a river delta is that as the rivers flow in, so rivers are going to flow into the ocean. And as they do that, the banks are going to erode. And so with the erosion of those banks, then that means that sediment gets carried toward the ocean. And gets deposited. Okay, so then you have this, you basically just have this buildup of sediment at the point where the river flows into the ocean. So here is a picture of the Nile River Delta. So here's the river flowing into the ocean, and you can see this all this black is the buildup of that sediment before it flows into the ocean. Okay, so that is a river delta estuary. And then the last one that we will talk about is called a tectonic estuary. So at the very beginning of the semester, we talked about how the Earth is made up of plates, and then obviously there is the crust of the Earth, and we talked about how you can get movement of those. And when you get movement of the plates and the crusts, what can happen is that you'll get these holes and basins that get formed due to that movement. And then with rising sea levels due to melting ice, then those holes and basins will fill with water. So one example of an estuary that is believed to have been formed by tectonic movement is San Francisco Bay. So let me show you a picture of San Francisco Bay, and we'll be able to see these basins that have filled with water. Okay, so here, so this is San Francisco Bay. So we have the ocean out here on the right. Over here is the ocean. And then due to the movement of those plates, we get these basins. So these are deep areas that with the rising ocean water would fill with water, and so you get the formation of these bays. Okay, so that is the San Francisco Bay estuary, which is a tectonic estuary. Okay, so that's it for the different types of estuaries and how they are formed. So as you might imagine, because at an estuary you have the mixture of, or you have salt water and fresh water coming together, that's going to create some unique challenges to life in those areas. So remember that when we look at the salinity of different areas, so the ocean is about has a salinity of about 35%, and fresh water has a salinity of 0%. So what you have then in an estuary is you're going to have water that is a mixture of these two salinities, so that, you know, closer to the ocean you're going to have a higher salinity, closer to the water, closer to the river, you're going to have a lower salinity. And then of course the tides are also going to affect this, because as the tide goes in, you're going to have, so tide in, let's go ahead and write this out. So when the tide is in, or in other words, when you have a high tide, you're going to have more of the ocean toward the shore, right? So you're going to have a higher, it's going to increase the salinity, and then when the tide is out, then the salt water is going to, there will be less salt water toward the shore. And remember that salt water is more dense, right? So salt water is more dense than fresh water. And so what will tend to happen with the movement of the tide is that the salt water will stay on the bottom and the fresh water will stay on top. And you can actually kind of get a wedge formed with salt water across the bottom that with the tides, fresh water across the top with the tides, and that actually is called a salt wedge. So with the tides, just to summarize there, because salt water is more dense, you'll get salt water along the bottom, and because fresh water is less dense, fresh water will be along the top. And this creates a wedge that's called a salt wedge. So let me show you a picture of that. So this shows us, so if we have the, you can see the delineations of the salt water. So you can see as the water gets deeper, you're going to have a higher level of salinity at greater depths because the salt water has a greater density. And then where you closer to the surface, you're going to have more fresh water and lower levels of salinity. Okay, so it creates this wedge due to the differences in the density of salt water and fresh water. And so what happens is that because of the movement of the tides, organisms that live in this area, they may be exposed to different salinities all in one day. And so they need to have ways to be able to deal with that. So organisms that live in this area, because they're going to be exposed to different salinities, they have to be able to deal with those differences. And so we have some terms that we use to talk about organisms that live here. And so if we look at an estuary community, so remember community is all the organisms that, all the populations that live in a particular area. So they, because of the movement of the tide and the changes in salinity, they have to deal with constantly changing salinity. But also, as we saw with the intertidal zone, temperature also will change with the movement of the tides and with the changes in salinity. So there are some terms that we use to talk about organisms that live in this area. So let's talk about those terms. So the first one is called euryhaline. So when we say an organism is euryhaline, what we mean by that is that they can tolerate a wide range of salinities. And we'll look in a bit at how some of the ways that they do that. So euryhaline, organisms that live within an estuary that are able to tolerate a wide range of salinities. Okay, then a second term is the term stenohaline. And stenohaline are those organisms that can only tolerate a narrow range of salinity. So in other words, they're not very adaptable to the changes in salinity. They need to be in an area where the salinity doesn't change much. Okay, that's stenohaline. And then lastly, we have an area, you've probably heard this term before. We talk about the brackish area. And the brackish area is an area where you really get a mixture of the salt water and seawater. And so brackish, it means that it's less salty than seawater. But it is more salty, more salty than fresh water. So as you can imagine, you get some brackish areas where there are estuaries. So how do these organisms who live in an estuary, how do they adapt, how do they adapt's a good word. How do they deal with these changes in salinity? Well, two ways. Well, we've already talked about these, but let's put them out again, because now we can see how they directly apply in a marine environment. So some organisms are osmoconformers. And if you remember, an osmoconformer is one in which the body fluids of that organism change to match, they change salinity to match the environment. Oh. The body fluids change salinity to match the salinity of the environment. So if an animal is put in a situation where the salinity of the water is higher, the salinity of their body will become higher. If the salinity in the water that they are in is lower, then they change that. And we talked about some of the ways that they do that. So they are able to, through some special organisms or special organs in their body, they are able to release more salt or hang on to more salt so that they can change their salinity. So one example of an osmoconformer is a sea anemone. Okay, so that's one way that organisms deal with it. There are some that are just able to change their own salinity. Okay, then we have what are called osmoregulators. And what osmoregulators do is that they maintain a constant salinity within their body. So it doesn't matter what the outside environment is, they maintain constant salinity in their body. So how do they do this? Well, usually it involves the kidneys and the gills. So they can regulate the salt content so that it stays constant no matter what the changing salinity is. And here we are dealing primarily, fish are osmoregulators, and many crustaceans are osmoregulators. Okay, so that's a second way that they deal, that organisms, some organisms are osmoregulators. And then another way that living things will deal with changes in salinity is there are some that will just try to reduce exposure to the changing salinity. So they might close their shells. So when the tide comes in and the salinity is going to decrease, they might just close their shells so that they're not exposed to that increased salinity. And then another way that they might deal with it is just to burrow. So they might burrow in the mud or sand, and down at deeper levels, you're not going to get the fluctuations in the salinity will not be as much. Okay, so let's look at a picture here. So this picture shows us, so point out a few things here. So over here, so this area over here would represent the ocean, okay, over here with the triangles. And then as we get over here, so this is more this river is flowing into the ocean. So over here is going to be fresh water. And over here would be salt water. And then you're going to have a mixture in between. So this area here would be the brackish area. So its salt content is higher than fresh water, but lower than the salt water. So then these triangles and other figures represent different organisms. So if we look at the triangles, you can see that they are present in the salt water, but then they're also present all the way over into the brackish water. So what term would we use for those? Well, we would call those species euryhaline, because they, as you can see, they can tolerate a wide range in salinity, all the way from pure salt water to a brackish environment. Okay, so that represents the triangles. Okay, then we see over here in this area where we see the checkered board pattern, we would the organism, the species that live there, we would say they are stenohaline, because they can only live in a freshwater environment, so they cannot tolerate a very wide range of salinity at all. And then over here, so these would be stenohaline for fresh water, and over here these lines that go this way would represent stenohaline for salt water. Okay, so those organisms that can only live in salt water, and those organisms that only can live in fresh water, so they would both be, this would be stenohaline for salt water, this would be stenohaline for fresh water. And then lastly, we have those brackish species represented here by the dots that are able to survive in water that is a mixture of salt water and fresh water. And again, we also saw some of the euryhaline species in there as well, but the small dots represent those organisms that are live in a brackish, are able to live in a brackish area. Okay, so that helps to illustrate those different types of species and where they are able to survive, where they are able to live based on whether they are euryhaline or stenohaline, or whether they are brackish. And different organisms, as those that are able to survive in different salt concentrations, some of them would be osmoregulators, some of them would be osmoconformers. Okay, so let's look now at some estuary habitats. And the habitats that we are going to talk about are the wetlands, and then we'll talk a little bit about salt marshes, although we already talked a little bit about them before, and kind of related to the salt marshes are the mangrove forests, and let's see, oh, there's mudflats, and I guess that is it. Oh, well, also there's channels, and those also will. Okay, so these are different areas that we can find organisms living in, so different habitats. So let's look at a figure. So here, so these are the different habitats. So here you can see a wetland, and a subclassification of a wetland is a salt marsh that can include then mangrove forests. And then we have this mud flat area, and then down here we have this area that is called a channel. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the wetlands, the mud flat areas, and the channels, and then we'll finish up this chapter with that information. Okay, so let's talk first about the wetlands. So you saw there, when we look at our picture, you saw that they, they tend to be at higher elevations along the coast. And so, in other words, sometimes they might be covered with water at high tide, but they wouldn't be covered at low tide. So they may be covered at high tide. And usually, well, there's really two types of wetlands. There's a temperate wetland, and then there's a tropical wetland. So the temperate wetlands would be more of your salt marshes. So temperate means, not extremely hot, but a more moderate temperature range. So what you have in these salt marshes are, you have salt tolerant plants. So salt tolerant plants. And depending on where those plants are, they might farther from the ocean, they're going to be more like land plants, but they're still going to have to be able to deal with the salt spray. And as you get closer to the ocean, they're going to be plants that are a little more salt tolerant. In this temperate area, you'll tend to see some bacteria that live within a salt marsh. Some algae will live there. So there are some areas that don't have a lot of oxygen. And then you'll get some burrowing animals that live in a salt marsh. So things like snails, clams, shrimp. But then you'll also get some larger fish that would feed on the bacteria and algae, and also they'll also be predators of these other organisms. So you'll get large fish and birds living in a temperate zone that these would feed then on these burrowing animals. Okay, so I think I have a picture of a salt marsh. Let's see. Yeah, so here's a photo of a salt marsh. So this would be a more temperate climate. The plants growing around there would be more salt tolerant. You'll get fish living in this area that will feed on the animals that burrow into the soil or the sand. Okay, then the other type of wetland that is more prevalent that we see in a more tropical climate is the mangrove forests. And your book talks about different types of mangroves. So there are red mangroves, there are black, and there are white. We don't have time to go into all those, but basically in the mangrove forest, the roots are going to provide protection for organisms that live there. And as we saw before with sometimes with the mangrove forest, because soil and debris will tend to build up around the roots, you can actually get the formation of an island around a mangrove forest. Remember, we also said that these mangrove forests, the plants are the trees are salt tolerant, and so they have special glands that allow them to excrete the salt through their leaves. So in these areas, again, you're going to get burrowing animals. So you're going to get things like you'll get things like crustaceans living here. And then you'll still get some fish that can live around a mangrove forest. Some types of mangrove forests have a lower salt content, so the fish are able to survive there, or they're osmoconformers and they can keep their salt content constant. Around the mangrove forest, you will get some predators, obviously, and those predators would be things like you get frogs living here that would feed on these crustaceans and other fish, lizards, would live in a mangrove forest, and then you'll get some types of birds that would serve as predators to other organisms living there. Okay, so wetlands can be temperate or they can be tropical, and the tropical ones are your mangrove forests. Okay, so now let's look at the next level. We'll go back here and look at our figure, but mudflats. So we'll see in our figure that the mudflats tend to be at a lower level. So in the mudflats, these would be areas that are exposed during low tide. So in this area, there are very few, if any, land plants. What you do tend to get is because they can live, because they can grow on mud, you'll get a fair number of diatoms. And remember, go on mud. So you'll get very few land plants, but you will get a lot of seagrass. So remember, seagrass are those plants that have ways to be able to tolerate the salt content. In fact, some mudflats are they may be covered in seagrass. Let me see if I have a picture of that. No, that's a mangrove forest. Okay, so I don't have a picture of the mudflat of that particular thing, but some of these, some of the mudflat areas can actually be covered with seagrass, plants that are very tolerant, plants that basically live covered in water except for the low tide period, and they're able to tolerate the salt water. Since water doesn't penetrate mud very well, so you have a lot of anaerobic conditions. So you get a lot of bacteria and decomposition of dead organisms happening within this mud flat. In terms of organisms that live here, you're going to get a lot of burrowing animals. So again, you're going to they'll bury themselves into the sediment. One thing that you sometimes will see in this area is you might see what are called deposit feeders. So deposit feeders are those that feed from the sediment that's brought into from the river. So they feed on the river sediment. All that stuff that's carried into toward the ocean by the rivers. The problem, so these actually tend to be filter feeders, but the reason there aren't many of them is that, as you can imagine, if they're filtering through water that has all this sediment in it, the filters can tend to get clogged. So there are some deposit feeders that are filter feeders, but a lot of them are just burrowing animals, and they bury themselves in the sediment, and a lot of them will live on bacteria and other decomposing organisms that are in the mud. What we see, particularly in the mud flats, is that for estuaries in common, or in particular, we tend to see not a lot of species. So the variety of animals that live here is less, there's less variety than in some of the other marine ecosystems. So there's not a lot of species. However, those that are, the species that are there are present in large numbers. So there's a lot of the ones that are there, but there's just not as many different species that you see. Okay, then I guess let me mention channels, and then we'll mention one other thing about. Well, actually, let's stay on the mud flats because I want to show you a picture of. So one of the things that you see in a mud flat is that there will be birds that are predators for the organisms living in the mud flat. And so remember, you're having these organisms burrow into the mud, and as you can imagine, different organisms will burrow to different depths. And so when we look at birds that are predators in the mud flat, what we see is that different birds have different, the bills are different lengths. So here we have a ring plower whose bill will only go down to this depth. And then we have, something like a godwit who has a much longer, and a curlew has a much longer. And this is a good thing because it means that different birds are feeding at different depths. And so it prevents one organism from being completely wiped out. So if you just had birds feeding at this depth, every organism in that depth would be completely wiped out. But because you have a variety of lengths of bills, these birds are feeding at different levels, and so it provides a balance to the numbers of organisms that are living within a mud flat. So that's a pretty cool thing that we see that helps to maintain the balance within the mud flat. Okay, the last thing that I will mention then, in terms of a habitat, are the channels. So what the channels are is in a channel you would have water at both high tide and low tide. So they would be covered in water at both high tide and low tide. And the channels can be very narrow or they can be very wide. But some of the things that you see living here would be things like crabs. Oysters will live here. You'll see a lot of plankton. One of the, so if you remember, we talked about Andromynous fish. So like Andromynous fish, those are fish that they live their adult lives in the ocean, but then they migrate to fresh water to mate and to give birth. Well, one of the one of the ways that these channels are used is that sometimes these andromous fish will use the channels either for spawning or to raise their young. Spawning, raise their young. And the reason why, if you think about some reasons for that, there's plenty of food, and they also can be. It also is a way that they can be safe from predators, because these areas are covered during both high tide and low tide, and then other. Especially those andromous fish that are migrating, they may use the channels as like a stopping ground or like a resting ground. So as they are moving from the ocean to fresh water for spawning or for giving, or well, spawning, they may stop there to feed. But the other thing that it allows them to do is it allows them to adjust to the changes in salinity. Okay, so as they're moving from a saltwater environment to a freshwater environment, the channel is going to provide an in-between area where they can give their bodies a chance to adjust to that. Okay, so let's look at a picture of a channel, or we'll go back to that picture and you can see where the channel is. Okay, so the channel is down here, and so you can see it will be covered both during low tide and high tide. So again, in general, what we would say about estuaries is that they have few types of species compared to others, but there's a lot of organisms, because those that are present in large numbers. Okay, so that doesn't mean that it's not a diverse. It is it's still a diverse ecosystem. It's just not as diverse as some of the others, and there is certainly plenty of food available. And in fact, the species that do live there tend to be a lot of producers there, so there's plenty of nutrients for the producers, and then the consumers can eat the producers, and any excess then is able to get distributed throughout the rest of the ocean. So the estuaries are important to the entire marine environment because of that. Okay, so that is it for Module 10, Marine Biology.